thinking into your heads, in the sense that, you should all probably know the basics of the disadvantage by now. You should probably know what uniqueness means, what links are, how internal links work, what impacts are, and hopefully you've had a little bit of experience developing disadvantages so that they have, a lot of depth to them and they're not just, novice level 1, 2, 3 blips and assertions. So hopefully you're at a point where you will be able to take some of the content of this lecture and use it to make your disads even better. So I think it's important, first of all, to talk about why we want to run disadvantages. I mean, some of this may be basic, but I think it's important to understand the strategic underpinning to the disad before I just go and start talking about them. So the first reason that we read disads is offense, offense, offense. In the world of the plan versus the world of the status quo, your defensive arguments describe why the status quo is acceptable. Negative offensive arguments describe why the status quo is preferable. Absent reasons to prefer the status quo, the negative would never win. So the purpose of the disadvantage is to provide a reason to prefer the status quo over merely simply accepting the status quo as being sort of not bad. You want to frame the status quo as being good. Obviously, if you've got a counterplan, that changes slightly, but that's the basic logic of why we want to have offensive arguments. And usually disads are going to be the best way to develop in-depth offense that is relatively difficult to beat if you do it correctly. The second reason to run disadvantages is to challenge the rationale of the affirmative. Right? So most affirmatives are built upon a fundamental presumption that some particular action is good. But all affirmatives, all cases, are going to have certain trade-offs and they're going to have certain opportunity costs. There is no such thing as a policy option that has literally no disadvantages to it. So the classic example is anytime you have a case that promotes economic development, chances are that they're going to be pitted against environmental protections. This is a classic example used in public policy planning. Right? It's very difficult to improve the economy with no cost to the environment. So disadvantages are your inroads to unstated trade-offs that are present in the case. So namely that increased economic activity will probably have negative environmental consequences either immediately or somewhere down the line. So disadvantages serve to jam the imaginary world of the app and refashion the narrative of the round. The best app will have the judge believing that everything is ponies and fairy tales and rainbows. The negative job is to disrupt that narrative, and disadvantages are the way to do that. The third reason why you might run disadvantages is that the world of the negative may change. The PMC does not. What I mean to say by this is that disadvantages can operate both in the world of the status quo and in the world of a competitive policy option simultaneously and independently. The disadvantages can operate both in the world of the status quo and in the world of a competitive counterplan simultaneously and independently. If you were at my answering counterplans and disad lectures, you might remember the boulder example I used of a disad, where uniqueness is that there's a boulder resting on a cliff right now. The link is that the plan causes the boulder to fall over the cliff. The internal link is that the boulder plummets towards the highway below, and the impact is that the boulder crushes several unfortunate passing motorists and they die. That is like a really basic disadvantage. So disadvantages can operate simultaneously in two worlds because the boulder will fall off the cliff if the PM passes, and that doesn't change even if you kick out of the counterplan that you read. Boulder's still going to fall down. Disads enable flexibility, and they make the negative job easier going into the block. So those are three basic reasons why we read disadvantages and why they are important to a negative strategy. So now I want to talk about a couple of points of strategy and tactics that involve running disadvantages and should hopefully allow you to strengthen the disadvantages that you prepare and then read in round. So the first point of strategy is that disadvantages rarely work well on their own. So I just talked about the third rationale for reading a disad, which is that it can function in multiple different worlds, right? So disadvantages ideally can be paired with counterplans. They don't always have to be paired with counterplans, but because of that flexible aspect of disad, it is really, really strategic to pair a disadvantage with a counterplan that solves the case and solves the disadvantage as well. If you do not read a counterplan, however, you cannot simply bank on the disad alone being enough to win you the round. You will probably also have to make arguments on the case. So case arguments can be, just a combination of case defense. You can make arguments like the status quo solves the case. You can read impact defense. There are many options available to you on the case debate, but as a negative, if you don't read a counterplan, you really, really have to make sure that you spend 1 or 2 minutes on the case debate in addition to reading a disadvantage. The reason why a disadvantage really works well on its own is because if you concede the app can have a really, really easy job of trying to outweigh the negative, especially if solvency is conceded. They're probably going to beat you on a probability level most of the time, given the way that judges tend to view affirmatives and view the outcomes of changes as opposed to not changing. So it's a good idea to read case defense or other case arguments that essentially prevent the affirmative from simply weighing the app straight up against the disad. Second strategic point is storytelling. And so storytelling is simply the idea that every disadvantage is essentially telling a story. The hardest disadvantage for the entry to answer is a disad where the general story is intuitive and is consistent with known facts about the world. Disadvantages are inherently predictive. They make predictions about the consequent hypothetical policy changes, which means that your job is to make those predictions sound as plausible as possible. Judges will reward you handsomely if your disadvantages make sense. There are 4 ways that we can improve storytelling of disadvantages. The first way to improve storytelling is to use empirical examples. Examples are the currency of parliamentary debate. I've heard this over and over and over again. You need to have examples. The way that we use examples is we point to something similar to the story of the disadvantage that happened previously, and then use it as a warrant to explain why the same thing could happen in the present. Take stuff that happened before that's similar to the disadvantage, and then try to use it as a warrant and apply it to the present. So for example, if you're running a disadvantage that is a federal government shutdown disadvantage, meaning that federal government is not going to be funded because of political infighting, then you would want to use previous government shutdowns as empirical examples for why another shutdown could occur in the future. So you might point to the extended government shutdown in 1995 and 1996. You could also point to the very recent government shutdown of 2013 from last year. And so you want to use these as examples of why future government shutdowns are likely and could occur. Obviously, the danger with using empirical examples is that you need to be able to distinguish your scenario from previous scenarios that didn't have very severe impacts. Right? So it's very, very difficult to read a government shutdown disadvantage and then tried to say that the impact of a government shutdown now would be bad, even though the government shutdown in 2013 didn't really do anything. So it's a negative challenge in that you need to be able to adapt previous examples, but you need to also be able to distinguish why the present is worse than those previous examples. So that is the first part of storytelling, is using empirical examples. The second job of the storyteller is to preempt inconsistencies. Preempt inconsistencies. What I mean by this is that the negative is not the only team that gets to use empirical examples. The MG gets to do the same thing when they're answering the disad. A smart MG who knows a lot of stuff can devastate a disadvantage if they use their own empirical examples to indicate holes in the disadvantage story. So for example, if you're running a debt ceiling disadvantage, right, the idea that Republicans would vote or would not vote to raise the federal debt ceiling and allow the United States to default, you need to preempt the argument that Congress has never allowed a default to occur. Even last year and 2 years prior to that, when partisan tensions were at their highest, we had a credit downgrade, but we did not actually ever reach the point of defaulting. If you're running a disad that says that the U.S. is going to default on its debt because Republicans are going to refuse to raise the debt ceiling, you need to have strong reasons for why that could occur now, even though it did not happen in similar circumstances in the past. You have to resolve inconsistencies and get ahead of them. Yes?
Can you call that out on yourself? So like you feel like, yeah, it happened like this and that didn't happen that time, but because this is happening in status quo, it don't happen this time? Does that make sense?
Yeah, what you should do is you should identify how the status quo right now is different than the status quo when the inconsistency occurred. So I don't know if there's anything different about the political situation now compared to the political situation, a year ago. But, perhaps we'll get to a point where some major political change occurs, like the Tea Party makes massive gains in the midterm elections that would allow for you to say that a debt ceiling disad has credible propensity to occur. I don't know, maybe the Tea Party picks up a bunch of seats in November, they make even more demands to shift Congress even farther to the right, and so that could be a potential warrant for why, even though the debt ceiling has always been raised in the past, there's a risk it won't be raised this time. Okay. Third, specificity. So sometimes you will be in a situation where your disadvantage is very innovative, or it deals with conditions that have no obvious past parallels. It's super easy to run a government shutdown disad because the government has been shut down before, so we know what happens. However, if you're running a disad that doesn't really have any previous precedent, either because it deals with something that is so new, or it simply doesn't have any obvious parallel, then you need to rely on specificity in order to develop a compelling narrative. So, for example, there in the past couple of years has been this situation involving rare earth metal shortages. I don't know if any of you are familiar with rare earth metals. Rare earth metals are actually not rare. They're just a little bit expensive, or I should say dirty, to mine and produce. China controls over 90% of the world's rare earth metal supply. And so a common disadvantage that was being run was that China was starting to restrict the amount of rare earth metals that they exported to countries like the United States, which would threaten many high-tech industries that rely on those elements in order to build stuff that is important to modern technology. So that situation is kind of interesting. Like, there's no real, we've never had a situation where rare earth metals were ever being controlled by a single country. So in that case, you need to rely on specificity in order to make that disad story compelling. So the way that we develop specificity is we can do a couple of things. So for example, we can quote specific agents. So when you're in prep, find news stories where the agents in question discuss what their expectations of future policy are. So if you're running a disad that China might cut off rare earth metals, you should find some Chinese officials that talk about why they would do that and under what conditions that would be most likely to occur. To find specific quotes from agents. You should also cite specific studies or papers. Right? So obviously there's no evidence per se in parliamentary debate, like in policy debate, but that doesn't mean you can't still cite studies. Right? If you can find a really good, Department of Defense study talking about the strategic implications of having rare earth metals cut off, you should cite that. You should say, according to this report by the Department of Defense, X, Y, and Z reasons could precede a move by China to cut off rare earth metal exports. The more specific those reports are, the more warrants you develop for your story. Additionally, your story always builds credibility when you start referencing outside sources out of the round. So if you're referencing officials, reports, like published information, it just makes it seem more credible as a storyteller. So as a storyteller, you always want to rely on drawing in outside sources, especially when you're talking about quantitative data like statistics and stuff like that. Another thing you can do is you can look for consensus among sources. If many different sources agree on the same general line of thinking, you can use that as a reason for why, basically groupthink is indicative of a likely scenario. So cite consensus if one is available. So storytelling. Use empirical examples, preempt inconsistencies, rely on specificity. Fourth, parsimony. Your disadvantages should be parsimonious. Does anybody know what the word parsimony means?
No.
Yes?
I was going to say, like, simple?
Simple, it's actually a little bit more than just simple. Parsimonious simply means that it should have as few parts as possible. You can run very, very complex disadvantages, but ideally they should have as few parts as possible. Yes?
Is that because when we, it decreases probability, because this would have to have, all these links have to happen in order to get to those impacts?
Exactly. The longer your internal link chain is, the more opportunities the MG has to point out a weak link and sever it. If your internal link chain is ever severed, you have no impact to your disad. So parsimony. You want your story as few chapters as possible. However, your chapters should be very long, meaning that you should have a relatively condensed number of arguments, but each of those arguments should be extensively supported. So if I were to try to diagram this, a bad disadvantage would look something like this. There would be a relatively long chain with not a whole lot of arguments to it. A good disadvantage would look more like this. It's short, but it's expanded in terms of the amount of backing that each individual argument is given. So ideally, your disadvantage should be parsimonious. It can still be complex, but the complexity should come out in your backing for each of your arguments. So you could have disadvantages with 30 arguments, but most of those arguments should come in the form of subpoints that provide support for your disadvantage. So basically, it's better to force the MG to go after 2 or 3 very heavily fortified internal links that have 3 or 4 subpoints each than it is to allow them to simply cherry pick from a bunch of relatively weakly backed up internal links. So parsimony is the 4th sign of good story. Any questions about storytelling? So that is pretty theoretical. So when you try to put it in practice, you really just have to use specific contextual cues to guide the development of your disadvantage. So that deals with storytelling. Next, I want to talk about uniqueness. Advanced issues involving uniqueness. So, first of all, strong uniqueness arguments will identify a direction. Many younger debaters often think of uniqueness in very narrow terms, just what is happening right this moment. However, the status quo is not static. What's happening right now at this moment just lacks the bigger picture involving the status quo that a disadvantage should capture. You don't just want to describe how the status quo is right now. You want to describe the direction that the status quo has been moving in. So to do that, you identify, for example, events that have occurred in the recent past, the change from the past to the immediate present, and then, ideally, a predictive uniqueness about expectations of the future. Where are we going to go from here if nothing changes? So ideally, the status quo should be moving away from the disadvantage. That is to say that if the status quo were to remain unchanged, the probability of external forces triggering the disadvantage should approach zero as time passes. That was complicated, so I'm going to give you an example. A very simple economy disadvantage. When you want an economy disadvantage, you want to argue that the economy is going to be strong in the status quo. There's no chance of the economy decreasing in the status quo. So to provide a direction for uniqueness, you would indicate the starting point, the past, which is to say that for the last couple of years, the economy has gradually been recovering. Then you just bring in a bunch of warrants, like the stock market has been going up, unemployment has gradually been going down, businesses are spending more capital, there's more investment going on, the housing market is heating up again. That's all stuff that's been occurring in the past couple of years. Then you describe exactly what the economy is right now. So you list, for example, the current state of the stock market, current unemployment rate, current business confidence level, investor confidence, whatever you think might help you. And then ideally, you should predict how the economy is going to develop in the future. So you would name specific conditions that are indicative of the economy continuing to either grow or remain stable. Obviously, you don't want to be so rosy with your predictions that the affirmative could just run uniqueness overwhelms the link arguments. So you ideally should be like, the economy is steady right now, but growth for the next couple of years is going to be pretty precipitous, meaning it's not going to be a sure thing, right? So that is what we refer to as identifying a direction. It's a very good idea to do that. Next, strong uniqueness arguments will also establish a specific brink. A brink. Not to be confused with a link. A brink is exactly what it sounds like. It's simply the threshold or the tipping point that must be passed in order for the disadvantage story to occur. So for the boulder example I mentioned at the beginning, the brink is simply the point at which the inertia of the boulder exceeds zero, when it starts to move and starts to fall off the cliff. Once the boulder passes the brink, then it is destined to fall onto the highway. Nothing can intervene to stop that movement. So the reason that we want to establish a unique brink is so that we can identify that the link is enough to move us past that brink. We want to win that the link is sufficient to pass the brink and trigger the impact. if you don't have a brink, then there's not necessarily a warrant for why your internal link change should occur. So if you're reading an economy disadvantage, you might, be able to successfully argue that the plan would be bad for the economy. But if you're not able to successfully argue that it would push us over the brink of a recession, you might not be able to get access to a large-scale, resource war type economic collapse scenario. So you need to identify a brink so that when you get to your link, you can say the magnitude of the link is sufficient to push us over the threshold of the disad. However, the thing with the brink is it's tricky to deal with because it has a natural tension with the link story. Because the negative wants to argue that the brink will not be passed or not be reached in the status quo. However, at the same time, the negative wants to indicate that the plan alone is sufficient to cross the threshold. So that can be a problem because, if the plan action is relatively minor, then the affirmative has to be able to demonstrate that the plan, even if the plan gets us over the brink, that there's nothing else in the status quo that can do the same thing. If there are other things in the status quo that could push us past a brink that is, really small, then probability-wise, there doesn't really seem to be much of a reason why the disadvantage is unique or is specific enough to the app. So there's a tension there that you have to be aware of, because otherwise a good MG will get up and say, the brink is so small that there are 3 other policies in the status quo that can do the exact same thing and have the exact same impact, all for cause for this to occur. And that is not a good prediction for the negative to be in. Any questions about uniqueness? Yes?
So could you run 2 Disads where you have contradictory uniquenesses? Like, so if they say the school is going to solve this, but then links to this other DA, is there a way of kind of wording that or running things like that nature?
Contradictory disads, if you're talking about contradictory uniqueness, you cannot say both the economy is going up in the status quo and the economy is going down.
Not that. So I guess not like on the uniqueness level, but just contradictory disads, where fine they say this is not happening, so they link to this one, or they try to beat this one, but they link to the other one, like get them to buy.
Can you give me an example?
I don't have one. I'm asking if that is possible. Like
econ good, plan hurts, econ bad impact, or then like the other uniqueness is like econ bad, like plan makes econ better.
Yeah, you cannot do that.
Yeah,
because it's a kind of the equivalent of like a double turn.
Yeah.
In the sense that if you make arguments about why the economy is both good and bad, and the economy is both going up and going down, like all the app has to do to answer that is concede one set of arguments and concede the other set of arguments, and say something like, on one disad, they argued that the plan decreases the economy, but on the other disad, they said that decreasing the economy is good. We'll concede both those arguments. Plan does decrease the economy, but that's an advantage to the plan because you contradicted yourself with two conflicting sets of arguments. So you'd be double turning yourself if you did that. So do not run disadvantages that are totally contradictory like that.
Okay.
Okay. Next. Read multiple links. Most plans do not just do one thing, they do many things. So a smart negative team will try to draw on as many links as possible. So the benefit to having multiple links is that the app has to answer all of them. So if you read 4 different links and the app puts really good defense in 3 of those link arguments, but they forget about the 4th link argument, then when you get to the block, you have a really easy job because they've conceded one of your link stories. So even if 3 of your links are not so true, the fourth conceded link is still considered to be dropped through, and you can use that and just pile on and make it so that that link controls how the disad story goes down. So reading multiple links gives you multiple options. Additionally, reading multiple links is sort of the opposite of the typical problem that negatives face with internal link stories, which is the idea that if an internal link is severed, the disad is dead. When you read multiple links, it doesn't matter if, some of those links are severed, so long as a couple of links still remain, you still get your disad. So in a sense, reading multiple links is one way that you can combat the problem of if we lose our link, we lose our disad. So it's a smart idea to do that. Yes?
So when you're going against a disadvantage and somebody reads off like 10 links, if you don't touch on every single one of them, because I had that happen, so it's like you can see
Yeah.
I'm like, bullshit.
It makes it challenging for the app to answer.
Yeah.
And so at that point, the app would probably need to rely more on link turns, which indicate that even if there are links, there are reasons why the affirmative makes those links not matter, or why the app can devise link turns that outweigh those links, and that sort of work can be done comparatively.
Okay.
But if you can't think of any link turns and you're just getting swamped at the link level, it might be a better idea to focus on attacking some other part of the disad. So, instead of focusing on the links, maybe you focus on trying to cut off the internal links. Or read like, a minute and a half of impact defense and impact turns or something, somewhat out of the box. So when you're answering a disad, it can be strategic to just ignore portions of the disad that the negative is really heavily fortified and just go after the weakest parts. Did I see your hands?
Yeah, well, and then because you had said, well, if they have 10 links, they concede, cool, this is good, but the impact turn, they said this is going to be bad, it's actually in turn going to be good for these reasons. So concede all 10 links and say how that's going to lead to something good.
Yeah, if you impact turn, generally you will, if you want to be strategic, you can simply concede the links. Because what happens is, if you read no link argument, but you also read impact turns, it still gives the negative the ability to kick out of the disad, because they can simply say, extend the affirmative's no link argument, we're not going for the disad, their impact turns go away. So, if you want to do the unorthodox, 2 minutes of straight impact turns or internal link turns, yeah, sure, it can be a good idea to just not read no link arguments. So, an example of having multiple links. So let's just say that you read a business confidence disad. You think that the plan is going to reduce business confidence. Maybe the plan is a government bill. Let's just say it's the government bill or the EPA policy that reduces the amount of carbon that coal plants are allowed to emit into the atmosphere. And you want to read a business confidence argument. I can think of about 15 million links about why the businesses might not be too thrilled with that. So first, it might increase electricity costs. All businesses have electricity costs. They're a fixed cost. They can't really cut it anyhow. So if you increase electricity costs, it's going to hurt all businesses' bottom lines. Second, it's a really intrusive piece of regulation, right? Businesses generally don't like it when the government interferes in the economy and the basis of the environment. They might think that the EPA may do similar, even more severe actions in the future. So business confidence might be shaken by the expectation of future intrusions on businesses' ability to operate. Third, there might be, I'm not going to go any further, but you can read many, many different types of links to the same policy. So if you read as many as possible, it's generally a good idea. Any questions about that? Cool. Fifth, turn the affirmative. Your disadvantage should turn the affirmative. Always try to make a way to find the disad turn the app, which is to say that the disadvantage should always be able to lead to the same sort of impact that the affirmative claims to solve for. If the affirmative claims to solve for the economy, your disad should hopefully somewhere include a reason about why the disadvantage hurts the economy. So why is it strategic to turn the affirmative? It is strategic because it basically gives you ammunition against the case that doesn't require you to win any case arguments. So if doing the app is good for the economy, but it's also bad for the economy, it's not a reason to do the app. It's sort of a, what's the word, a wash is what I'm looking for. Right, so if both teams can impact out the same impact, then it becomes a wash. And then that gives the negative the ability to use other offense to essentially outweigh the affirmative. So when you turn the app, a lot of times you have to be inventive. So if the affirmative claims to solve for the economy, they make the economy better, and you just prepare a disadvantaged impact that deals with, like, I don't know, maybe like U.S.-Russian relations, and the impact is U.S.-Russia war, or just generic war. So at that point, your disad isn't really intuitively connected to the economy. So you want to be inventive, and you want to make the argument that U.S.-Russia war would also tank the economy. Why would that be? Well, first of all, the U.S. and Russia control an enormous amount of the world's resources. There were interruptions to the supply of those resources to other countries that would have devastating effects. Especially, for example, if Russia were to cut off the supply of natural gas to Western Europe. That could potentially be a scenario. You could also say something along the lines of war reduces global trade. It increases the insecurity of shipments and makes it so that suppliers are less willing to export things. So many, many reasons about why war leads to economic collapse. And I guess the obvious thing is war blows stuff up. That's never good for the economy. So, you want to make arguments that are inventive and explain how the disad can lead to a turn of the app, even if in prep time you don't necessarily plan your disad that way. So be inventive, find ways to spin your impact scenario into something that can turn the app. So it's just really a separate branch of your impact scenario. You have the impact scenario that you prepped, and then coming out of that, you should have other impact scenarios that turn the app. Really strategic thing to do. However, you need to remember that your impact is not going to be a perfect clone of the affirmative. So there's a big difference between, claiming to solve the economy by, I don't know, increasing resource extraction in the Arctic, and an economic decline that would occur as a consequence of a U.S.-Russia war. Like, the scenarios are different. So even if you have the same terminal impact, your internal link story to how you get to that impact is probably going to be different. And so what the negative needs to do is start comparative impact calculus in the LOC that explains why your version of the impact is worse. Why would an economic collapse that occurs as a consequence of a U.S.-Russia war be worse than an economic collapse in the world where we don't take advantage of all the oil and fossil fuels that are locked up in the Arctic Ocean? That would be something that you want to focus on. So, you might talk about time frame. If the U.S. were to start a war with Russia and it occurred right away, that would occur way before we have an opportunity to start taking, trillions of dollars of resources out of the ground in a relatively inhospitable, remote place. So you could say our internal link story happens faster, which means we're not just a parallel turn of the app, we are simply going beyond that, and we are making the impact worse. So identify why your internal link makes the impact bigger, more probable, faster, irreversible in comparison to the affirmative's internal link story. Turning the app also helps you answer try or die affirmatives. Try or die is a phrase that is overused, but it is overused for good reason, because it is, when true, strategic, in the sense that it puts the onus on the negative to really provide a reason for why the impact is either not inevitable or is outweighed. However, it's difficult to outweigh an inevitable impact that causes extinction, right? Because the affirmative will be like, we have to act, or we are screwed no matter what we do. If you turn the impact, you can make try or die go away. If we are screwed, the negative wants to be sure that we're screwed no matter what. If the economy is going to collapse in the status quo and cause extinction, and it's inevitable, the negative should come right back and say that the plan will do the exact same thing. And not only that, but the plan will make it happen faster. You know, try or die, the thing with that is it's inevitable, but often it's unclear as to when the actual scenario will unfold. So the best way to be try or die is to turn the impact and then say that the plan makes the impact happen faster. So that just is a good strategic way of dealing with that. Any questions about turning the app? A related way of, I guess, turning the app, although it's a little bit different, is you can say that the disad takes out solvency of the app. There are arguments about why, in the world of the disadvantage, it isn't possible to solve the case. So you could make, maybe the app is a food assistance to Africa case. And so you are running an affirmative that increases, agricultural production and ships all the food to Africa. Maybe the negative gets up and say that's bad because there are some carbon-intensive farming policies being used to generate that food, and so you would accelerate climate change. And the problem with accelerating climate change is you vastly increase food insecurity, but that's turning the app. But furthermore, it makes it harder to actually grow food because of changing environmental conditions. So you can say that in the long run, the disad means the app can't solve because the app literally cannot produce. The world of the affirmative will eventually end up in a place where we're not able to produce enough food to distribute to those who need it. So that's how you can use a disad to demonstrate why the app solvency is reduced or mitigated or goes down or whatnot. Okay. So number 6, solve the affirmative. This is even better than turning the app. It is a rare situation where you are able to solve the affirmative, but if you can argue that there is something in the status quo that can solve the affirmative impacts, but the disadvantage means that that status quo thing will not happen, then you can say that the status quo solves the app and the app makes it so that that thing that could solve the app impact can no longer happen. Yes?
So that'd kind of be like, for instance, last year, I think I was at some kind of tournament where there was an immigration topic, but immigration politics was still unique. So we could just run immigration politics, whereas the app was a smaller action, the larger, Senate bill would have solved it. Would that be, an example of that kind of?
Yeah, you could say, a lot of times when I read politics disadvantages, I would say that the politics bill solved the app.
Okay, yeah.
Not the app, but the actual bill actually passing right now. If you're reading a politics disad, depending on the situation, sometimes you can argue that the stuff that's in that politics bill could solve the affirmative. And that makes it so that it is a pseudo counterplan. So it's a very close cousin of status quo solves the app, except you're being a little bit more specific and you're saying it's related to the disadvantage. And so it's not just that the status quo solves the app, it's now the affirmative is jeopardizing the ability of the status quo to solve the app. So that's how it's a little bit distinct from the status quo solves the app argument. So in this case, it's not just defense, it's offense. Because the affirmative is preventing conditions that would allow itself to be resolved without doing the act. So extremely strategic. So you can do that with politics bills. On a lot of foreign topics, I would read diplomatic talks or peace talks. So at NPTE a couple years ago, I read this ad about how the U.S. cutting off drug war support to Colombia would derail peace talks between PARP, the paramilitary group, and the Colombian government. And those peace talks would solve the app because they would end the drug war and the conflict occurring in Colombia. So that's an example of an argument that you might be able to do where you say that the Disads solves the app. Any questions about that? Yes?
We usually labeling this triality LSC as reasons why the Disads solves the affirmative, or instead of more of an MO, block extension, or blow up, just something for them to blow up. Should we be labeling it, or should we use that as a question?
You can give me an example of what you're talking about.
Okay, so for example, currently, let's say the plan derails a farm bill from passing, derails a farm bill from passing, and the plan just to have essentially solve food security. Okay. In a world where the farm bill doesn't pass, we can't have proper food subsidies anyways, right? Which means that food security gets turned because of this act derails the farm bill. Should the LSC be the Disad also solve the affirmative, or should the MO be saying this also needs to solve the affirmative? It's just more of a question.
So you're wondering if both solves the app, but also results in conditions where the app can't be solved.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you can do both. I mean, it's strategic, to do both approaches and say that, not only can the status quo, or not only can this thing in the status quo solve the app, but the app makes it so that this other thing that would be able to solve it can't solve it now. That's something you should absolutely do. Okay. I'm going to race through this last thing if I can let you go. So 7, diversify your impacts. An impact scenario can have multiple potential terminal impacts. So remember, there are a large spectrum of possible outcomes for any given scenario. Debaters have a tendency to talk about the most extreme outcome of a scenario, meaning that, if we have this imaginary line of possible outcomes, possible impacts that occur as a consequence of a plan, debaters tend to focus on the most extreme end, and they tend to ignore all the stuff that is, potentially more probable but has a lower magnitude. When you're a negative team, it can be strategic to talk about more of the spectrum. Like if you read an economic collapse or an economic decline Disad, sure, you might want to read a terminal extinction level economic decline leads to the destruction of all life on Earth, but it can be strategic to also talk about more systemic impacts. So, for example, economic decline leads to an increase in poverty, leads to an increase in structural systemic impacts that are highly probable. We know they occur. Poverty has killed more people than all world wars combined. That can be super strategic to talk about because when you get to impact calculus, the affirmative can't just stand up and say, your impact has a tiny probability and is never going to happen. You can actually say, no, our impact also is inclusive of high probability, high time frame impact, which means that not only can you earn negative on magnitude, but you can also independently earn negative on probability and time frame. So diversify your impact scenarios. So mixing and matching impacts like poverty and resource wars can be strategic to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So finally, if you're running a counterplan, you may consider asking your judge to revert to the status quo. Does anybody know what that means? I'm sorry? No, that's not what that means. When we talk about reverting to the status quo, we essentially mean to say that if the negative thinks that the counterplan is not, at the end of the round, if the counterplan is not something the judge would vote for, either because it's not competitive, like if the app wins a term, or because there's a disadvantage to the counterplan that makes the affirmative a better idea, a judge can revert to the status quo, meaning that they would then get rid of the counterplan and compare the disadvantage to the plan, without even considering the counterplan. So, maybe your counterplan is not competitive. There is a permutation that proves that. But maybe your disadvantage still outweighs the app. You can ask your judge to revert to the status quo and say in the LOR, even if the counterplan is not competitive, revert to the status quo, compare the disadvantage to the plan, because the disad is still going to outweigh. However, you need to have reasons for why the judge should do that. So, you can say, for example, congratulations, the affirmative passed its test. A counterplan, just beating a counterplan doesn't mean that the app is automatically a good idea, right? Best policy options always mean that we should select the best available policy, right? Policymakers don't get two competing proposals and then immediately say, oh, this one proposal is better, I'm going to ignore this other stacked proposal that could also read. They're going to compare all available options, meaning that a good policymaker, the judge, should evaluate the status quo in addition to the counterplan. If you're the affirmative, you may want to say that the judge should not revert, because reverting is abusive. It is probably the worst abuse of conditionality. It's not reciprocal, right? The negative gets two different worlds at the end of the debate, and the affirmative only gets one. It makes it so that the app has to answer both the negative worlds, but the negative doesn't have to do the reverse. Not very fun if you're the affirmative. So if somebody tries to tell the judge to revert to the status quo, and you're the PMR, you might want to make reasons for why that's a bad idea. Any questions about that concept or anything else about the lecture? Alrighty. Good job. And I think we have about 6 minutes until the next lecture starts.